Bethany, you happy to get started?
Yeah.
I'll go if we're ready. Okay, so hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. A little disclaimer here that we've got a lot of technology and screen sharing and all sorts going on because we're trying to demo a couple of different devices. So apologies for that. You can currently see me from a weird angle, but I'm looking at this screen, but hopefully it'll all make sense. So thanks for joining both myself and Bethany this afternoon, where we're going to be exploring iOS apps. So our aim of the session really is to have a look at apps in relation to different access methods and what we kind of need to do in terms of accommodations so that we can use those apps, but also looking at kind of which apps we can use, how we can build in apps that can motivate people to maybe develop skills within their access method as well. So, as we know, in terms of the world of apps, it kind of started out small, and now we've got an absolute world of different apps. So I think in an article that Bethany found, actually, there's about 1,000 apps being developed every day. So it's constant kind of content that's being developed. And if you're like me, you know that pretty much anything that you do these days kind of involves an app. So if you want to go into your banking, even if you want to park your car, you've got to pay via an app. Book a doctor's appointment, it's through an app. Everything is done via apps these days. So what that means is that for those of us that are supporting people that have access needs, it kind of adds a bit of a layer of complication and thinking about, okay, well, it's great that there's all these apps that people can use, but we want to make sure that we can make their access method work for them. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be having a look at these considerations, and I put the link in the chat to a handout, and you could also use the QR code here on the screen. This is the handout that actually Bethany developed. We're going to refer to this throughout the session. It specifically refers to or focuses on eye gaze in this handout, but the principles can actually apply to all access methods. So we're going to talk about these 5 principles or kind of steps in relation to different access methods. So just want to kind of introduce each of these, and as I say, we'll be kind of touching on them as we go out throughout the session. So the first consideration is looking at the kind of user's current ability. So what skills do they have that they can kind of use for their device? So maybe they can do taps, scrolls, long press. What is needed for the app or applications that they are trying to use? So, for example, they may be able to, with touch access, they may be able to do simple taps, but they may be not able to do a press and a hold. So for things like just simple games, it's fine, but if they're wanting to do something that requires moving an object or moving something to another part of the screen, then maybe that's going to be difficult for them. So that kind of leads us on to our next step of, okay, so maybe there's something that they really want to use in terms of apps, but they don't currently have the skills to do that. So what can we do to build those skills? And is there actually an app that we can find that might help them to build that skill? So an example could be that maybe somebody needs to use something for work. And again, I'll use the example of maybe moving something around on a screen. Currently, that's quite difficult for them, but maybe we can find some simple games or other apps that can help them to practice that skill. So we're actually using the apps available to not only kind of meet their current needs, but also to upskill them so that they can use further skills as well. Motivation is obviously key. So when you're motivated, you're more likely to work harder and persevere while trying kind of access challenging apps. So it's always worth thinking, okay, well, we need to practice this movement, or whether it's, this skill in eye gaze. I need to find something that's really going to motivate them to do that. So whether it's accessing social media or playing a game that they really enjoy. So really thinking about how we can find something that will motivate that person so that we can practice these skills. And because we've got access to so many different apps and kind of content out there, it's quite easy to be able to find something that hopefully will kind of motivate them. Next is looking at iPadOS adjustments. So are the settings within the iPad itself that can actually help make the app more accessible for that client. And we're going to kind of dig into some of those in each access method. And then finally, are there actually any adjustments within the app itself that I can make that might help me to access that? So it could be changing the kind of layout of the app, modifying a response time or a timeout setting in a game, for example. You might be able to kind of change some of the settings. So instead of a drag, you can do it with 2 clicks or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply those 5 principles, or think about those 5 principles, whilst looking at 3 different access methods. So we're going to start off with touch. Then we go to Bethany's going to have a look at scanning and eye gaze as well. So while I switch my screens, Bethany, is there anything else that you wanted to say, anything that I may have missed?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it really well.
Okay.
Anybody have questions so far, or any troubles getting to the handout? Hopefully not. Let us know in the chat if you have.
Can I check which screen you can now see, Bethany?
I can see you on TD Pilot. I can see your screen. Looks like it's you are sharing your screen. It looks like it probably, it's the iPad. It's the TD Pilot screen.
It's really hard to see. I'm looking at my laptop and going, is that different to what this is? Okay.
Alice,
okay,
maybe turn on the camera on your computer so that we can see what you're doing with your hand on the TD Pilot.
That's a good idea. Okay, let's go to here. Hang on, let's move this out of the way. Oh, I can't find my settings, viewing options. Might have to forego that for a minute because I'm struggling.
Right. Here we go. I'm going to start video. See if that helps.
Oh yeah, can you do it? Oh,
yep, you got it. Great. Yes.
Now can you see 2 angles? Is that horrific? Okay, so let's get started then thinking about this. So thinking about those 5 principles. So I'm right now thinking about a touch user. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a case study just so that we can kind of put it into context. So the person that I'm thinking about with this is a young child. She is around 6-7 years old. She is using touch access via an iPad, and she is currently able to access the iPad for AAC. So she's using a communication app, and she's making some good progress. But both family and school would quite like to explore being able to use the app both for school but also for kind of leisure at home as well. So being able to use the iPad like her siblings are. Now, she's doing quite well with accessing with her hand, and we've determined that is the best access method for her. However, she is having some issue with making precise selections. So her hand will sometimes jitter when she's trying to select something, and she's making lots of accidental hits, and it's really making it difficult for her to access the iPad successfully. So we know that she can use a simple tap. She's doing that really well on her AAC app. We want to upskill her because she wants to be able to access some simple games that her brothers and sisters play at home. And then there are also some apps at school using that they would like her to engage with as well. And these apps need a little bit more kind of skills, so a little bit of a drag and hold, maybe a bit of swiping. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look and see what we can do to kind of make some adjustments to make her more successful in this area. So what I'm going to jump into straight away is looking at the iPad settings. So one of the considerations we talked about was actually looking into the iPad itself and seeing what settings we can adjust to make her a little bit more successful. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, as you can see in here, I am just in the general settings. If I can scroll down to home screen and dock, there is an option here where I can use a large icon, app icons. I'm just going to switch that off so that, I know it won't, I'm going to have to restart it. What this will do is it's going to make the apps, the icons on this home page a bit bigger. So first of all, a bigger target is going to be easier for her to hit. So that first thing is going to make it instantly a bit easier for her. So we're just turning on those large icons so that when she's scrolling through her apps or she's looking at her apps, that icon is just going to be a bit bigger. We know that bigger targets are easier to hit. So straight away, that's a nice, easy one to be able to do. Next, I'm going to go into the accessibility settings. And there's some brilliant settings in here. I don't know if you've explored these, or we could talk for hours about some of this. But I'm just going to go into the touch settings here. And there's a bunch of different things that I can do in here. So if I go to where it says touch accommodations, it's basically going to allow me to make a couple of changes that will make this a little bit easier for her. So the first thing that I can see here is a hold duration. So what this does is it means that in order to make a selection, I'm going to have to hold my finger on the button or on the location for a set amount of time before that button is selected. So if I toggle this on, you'll see straight away that it's going to give me a little time here, and I can adjust this time. And it's always going to be a little bit trial and error when you're trying this for the first time with somebody. So it's worth kind of trying a set time and then kind of seeing how they get on with it and making adjustments. But what this means now is that when I go to make a selection, I have got to hold for a certain amount of time before it will select. So here I can see that if I just do a little tap, it's not selecting anything. But if I hold it for 0.1 or whatever seconds it was that I did, it will now make that selection, 0.2 seconds. So advantage of this, in particular for this girl, is we mentioned that she was making lots of accidental hits because she was tapping, she had a bit of a tremor, so she was tapping the screen accidentally. So now you can see that if she makes a quick tap accidentally, she can't, it won't select until she holds it for that set amount. So as I said, that's a really good tool to support that. Next one, you can see here, we've got swipe gestures as well. So if I turn this on, this is quite a good one that I discovered quite recently. So obviously with a lot of iPad kind of settings or apps, it requires a lot of swiping, so swiping up a screen if you're on social media or YouTube or something like that. And again, this can be quite a tricky one for somebody that has a little bit less control over the hands, because what they'll often do is do some accidental swipes by placing their finger and moving it a little bit. that can often result in the page moving without them wanting to. So what we can do here is a little bit like the hold time, is that you can determine kind of how big a swipe you need to do for it to actually accept it as a swipe. So if I go to standard swipe, if I just try and show you on here, I don't know if you can see through the video, I'll try and, but the tiniest little bits of movement is swiping that screen. And so obviously if I've not got great control of that, it's going to be doing that all of the time. Whereas if I change this to, let's go for a ×6, make it a big movement, I have to do quite a big swipe before it'll actually move it. Whereas if I just do a little swipe of my finger, it's not going to change that. So that's another one that's quite a handy one to think about. Another one that's really useful is repeat taps. So again, this one is the length of time in which multiple touches are treated as a single touch. So again, if you've got somebody that's got a tremor, what will sometimes happen is that they'll press something multiple times. And what that can often happen is, let's say you're pressing a link on something, it changes to whatever the other screen is. And if you've got that tremor and you click again, it's going to keep changing to something that you didn't necessarily want it to do. So what this does is, again, allows a time that you can set in which time it won't accept more than one hit. So if you've got that tremor, again, you can do that so that it reduces those hits. So again, another one that's kind of a bit of trial and error in terms of time. So you have to kind of figure out what works best for that user. But it's a really kind of good one to know about as well. So that's kind of looking at some of the settings within the iOS itself. So within the iPad settings itself. I think, the only other one that I would mention that I think a lot of people know about these days anyway is looking at guided access. So sometimes it could be useful. What guided access will do is it will basically just kind of lock the iPad into that single app. And that can sometimes be useful because, again, if you've got somebody that's making accidental swipes, sometimes if you do a big swipe, it'll like close the app or move the app to somewhere else. So sometimes guided access could be useful as well. Of course, to start guided access, you have to be able to do a triple press on the top button. So depending on who it is, it's going to be somebody that's maybe going to be relying on a communication partner or carer to be able to access that, switch it on and off. But it's just another consideration to have. So I just wanted to then now think about a couple of different apps. So obviously the apps that we're using the majority of the time are designed just for simple touch users, right? So the apps themselves don't necessarily have any design features or accessibility features within them, which is why the kind of iOS settings can be really useful to kind of play around with. But it is kind of worth sometimes thinking about some of the different apps and what's available. So if I go into YouTube Kids, for example, one of the things that I noticed here that was quite handy, so I'm thinking about this little girl, for example, is that if she goes into, let's go for Pepper. It's quite
We're going to have a pumpkin party, and all your friends are invited.
We'll start by making a pumpkin lantern.
Oh, goody! How do we do that?
We draw a funny face.
I'll draw the eyes.
George can draw the nose.
And I'll draw the mouth.
That is a funny face.
Next, we cut it out.
I'll do the cutting because I'm a grown-up.
Is there any
Peppa and George can scoop out the inside.
Does that make any difference?
We use the insides
Okay.
to make my special pumpkin.
Sorry, I'll pause the video 1 second. Apologies.
It's
Okay.
the challenges of Zoom with
Challenges
this.
of Zoom and all the technology that we're using at the same time. So the one thing I found with YouTube Kids was that you can actually, so one of the considerations of watching videos is being able to, exactly what we just demonstrated, is being able to adjust the volume. So in YouTube Kids, it actually has an on-screen volume adjuster. So it means you don't have to rely on being able to press the buttons on the device itself. So that's quite a useful thing that I had thought about, because when I looked into the BBC iPlayer, for example, I don't think, let's try, this does not have in-app volume control. So that would rely on somebody being able to press the buttons. So it's things like that that are worth kind of considering, is how much autonomy that person's going to be able to have using that app. Do they have to rely on some of the hardware features that they're going to struggle to access? Is there stuff in-app that they'll be able to use instead? Now, I'm struggling because there was an app that I wanted to demonstrate that I don't think I've got on this iPad because I had to switch to another one. But let's just come into here. So this is a popular game that I'm sure you'll know about, and I think it's going to do some sound. So let me just see if I can. Let's see if this works. Okay, so is that noise on here as well, Bethany?
It's quite loud, but it's not bad.
Okay, let me come in and turn it off.
There we go. Perfect.
There we go. Better. Okay. So one of the things that I found when kind of looking through different apps is if you go into the settings option like here, you can often see if there are any adjustments that can be made. Ninja, Fruit Ninja, for example, I found that all you could do really was like switch the music on and off. And you can't really change any of the actions. So for this app, for example, it requires you to be able to swipe to access it. So with this little girl, for example, we know that she's doing simple taps, but she's not able to swipe yet. So either we can use this as an opportunity to upskill her, or find something that maybe doesn't require that skill if she's not quite ready for that yet. And so for this example, you've just got to basically swipe across the screen. So let me just show you. So it's kind of fairly low effort, but fairly high reward, especially if you're thinking about a young child. So with her, we are actually practicing that swipe action, but it's just a fun game. But we could then translate that swipe into maybe a literacy app where she's got to swipe to turn the page of a book, for example. So it's trying to think about ways that we can use the apps that are available to upskill our users to increase their independence as well. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover with this, Bethany. Was there anything else that I maybe have forgotten?
No, I don't think so. I think you did covered it really well. So what we're going to try to do now is switch from Alice's iPad to my iPad. So we'll see what happens. Alice is going to stop sharing hers, and I am going to try to start share mine. So let me see what I can do here. All right, so I'm going to hit start share content and screen and start broadcast. And we will hope that everything works together well. All right, so it looks like you're seeing my screen, so that's a positive thing. What you're seeing right now on my screen is just we want to go back through that mantra. So we have an individual, this is an adult who's been using scanning for quite a long time for AAC and now wants to access things on the iPad. And this is a person who's using automatic scanning. They're quite good at it. They're not using auditory scanning, they're just using visual scanning. But they want to do things like productivity. They want to schedule social engagements, manage their care, order groceries, shop on Amazon, job searches, planning their day, using Zoom, creating playlists on Spotify. There's all sorts of things that they want to be able to do. Now, one of the first things that we need to do then is think about what are they able to do right now? So we know the skill this person has right now is automatic scanning, single switch automatic scanning. So it's simple. Every time they touch the button, they're selecting something. So that's good for us to know that they can do that. The thing is that Apple's scanning requires often a lot more than that to be functional for this individual. So what we're going to do is kind of take a look at some of the things that we might want to do initially to set this person up. So as we're looking at upskilling, we want to make sure that we're helping them understand that the scan pattern may not be as regular on the iPad as it is on their communication device, that there are lots of options that are available within here that they need to understand what all of those icons mean in order to be able to use it effectively. There's also a tool called gliding, which for those of you who remember crosshair mouse, where it goes across this way and then down this way, and then that's where it's selected. That's something that's available on the iPad and very useful, actually. In terms of their interests, we know we want to really focus on those productivity things. So let's get started with some system setup. The first thing we're going to do is go into the settings, and we're going to make sure that our mouse is connected. So I have my Bluetooth mouse, and you can see Bluetooth is connected. I'm going to use just the one switch for now, and I am going to try to hold it up so you can see when I select. The next thing I'm going to do is swipe down to accessibility, and I am going to turn on under switch control. I'm going to turn that on right now. So immediately you'll be able to see that it looks like it's starting to do some scanning. So there are a number of things here that we can look at. First of all, we can look at what switches are being used. And in this case, we're using a switch, an external switch to select an item. That's the default that's on here. So we're going to leave that for now. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at some of the other controls. We have it right now in scanning style is auto scan. You can see you have manual and single switch step scanning as well. We have a scan time, a number of things that a lot of us are used to. The tap behavior that we have on is going to be always tap because that's what this person is used to. So let's see if we can make this work on this individual's device. We're going to start here before we go into any other features on the iPad. So I'm going to go up here to the home screen, and now I'm going to select to get into, and you can see as when I select, it's automatically opening up this scanning menu. So I'm going to escape from that and hit it again. There we go. Now it's going through, it's doing a row column scan within the items on this screen. Now, one thing that I've paid attention to and noticed is that there might be applications that this person wants to use a lot. And one thing that can be useful is to drag them along the very bottom of the screen. I'm just going to scan down there. Let me just escape with this. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, my bad. There we go. I'm just going to scan through. When we get down to the bottom section here, this section gives us the apps that are currently open as well as the ones that we've basically pinned down here. And for somebody who has one app that they use quite a bit, it could be useful to possibly pin it on the bottom, or even more so to arrange it in order on the iPad screen, starting with the upper left and moving across so that they can get to those in the order that they want to be able to, that they frequently use them. The other thing that you'll notice is that unlike what Alice did for the touch user, I left the icons small here. Now, obviously, if I have an individual who needs larger icons, I would change that just like she did. But in this case, the advantage of having smaller icons is that there's more applications on the screen. There's less moving from page to page within the app. So I have a bunch of icons here. I have a bunch of pages. But if I can, I want them to be able to stay on that first page, is because it's going to be faster for them to get to those icons. So let's take a look at a few other things within this application. We know that we want this individual to be able to use the calendar. So I'm going to go ahead and open the calendar, and I'm going to let it scan through until it starts rescanning. Oops. So right now you can see that I'm down in the bottom, in the taskbar at the bottom. And it's not letting me out of it. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind with this is always a challenge with the iPad scanning, because when we have it in just select, there are times when you can't get out of something. And that's something we need to be aware of. And this individual is going to have to start learning right away. So I'm going to go back into my settings, and instead of auto always tap, I'm going to change it to default. And now what you're going to see is that when I make a selection, it actually gives me a sub menu. This sub menu is really important because it gives us a way of, one, getting out of this particular area. Let's say I hit it by accident, or of doing a lot of other things with it that I might not typically be able to do. So I'm going to get into this calendar, and I'm going to tap. So now I'm in the calendar. Now, one of the things that I noticed about this calendar is that I'm actually unable to select a time. So when I go through this, watch the scanning behavior. It's actually not giving me, first of all, it's scanning in Zoom. That's part of the issue. And you know what I'm going to do, Alice? I am going to stop sharing my screen here. And I am going to go back into Zoom for a second and stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to share my screen through the computer so that you can see.
Okay, yeah, sounds good.
I'm going to use my calendar or my camera actually. So let me know if you would when you can see my iPad screen.
We can't quite see it. If you maybe move your screen down a bit.
Yep. So the first thing, I'm going to also exit this.
There we go. Yep, that's good. We can't hear you though. Hang on.
Yep, got it.
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
All right,
we got
very
you.
good. So when we go through this, I'm gonna select the calendar once it gets up to it again, and I'm going to, there we go, select the calendar and tap, and you can see that it's interesting. I keep missing the top row because it doesn't look like it's selected to me. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind. You know, when I use AAC software, this is not at all the way that I tap. I don't look for it that way. It's going to take some time for the person to get used to this. So getting back into the calendar, there we go. What you can see is the scan pattern is actually a really interesting one. It gives us a way of doing a lot of things, but it doesn't give us a way of doing certain things that we really need to. So for example, if I go into this menu up on top and I want to add an event, I can use the keyboard. This is great. So I'm just going to go in and type something on the keyboard. Let's say that this is what I want to do. Now that was an awful lot of taps to type something in on the keyboard. But let's say that that's all I want to do right now. So I'm going to close the keyboard, keeping my eye obviously on what I want to select, which is something I tend not to do very well. And I'll tap that. Now you can see I'm back scanning up here. But one of the problems we have is that when we go into time, it won't let us select the time. There's no way that it gives us to select the time here. Watch the scan pattern. And I can't really do much about it unless I use this extra menu. So if I had this in the way with just the tap that I had before, without the extra menu, I would not be able to select the time within here. Now, because I have that extra menu, I can go in here and select the time using decrement or increment, and it will move it up or down. So that's why that's the importance of this particular menu. And it makes the scanning, one, more complex, and two, it makes it something that requires a lot more hits. And I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind. Additionally, within the calendar, Within the keyboard, you noticed that I had to do a lot of hits just to get into that keyboard. So I'm going to cancel this for a second. And I'm going to discard the changes and go in again. Now, what you're seeing here again is that keyboard. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 hits for every letter. Now, if I go back into my scanning settings, you're going to see as I go down here, there's going to be an option to select, here it is, always tap keyboard keys. This eliminates the need to select tap. So I'm going to turn that on, and then I'm going to take us back into the calendar and do that again. So now I'm going to cancel this, discard my changes and go back in again. And now when I go into, oops, my error, sorry, I'm going to hit escape to get out of this. So the 2 dots on the bottom get you into the larger scan menu, and this is where you get to escape. So now it's trying to do a glide. For some reason, it seems to want to restart that. So I'm going to hit the plus and tap. And now what I can do is when I go into my keyboard, you can see that I immediately can tap. It doesn't require that extra hit. And that does make a big difference for a lot of our clients. Now it's interesting because I thought, well, maybe there's another calendar in here that would be easier for this person to be able to access. So I downloaded this Simple Cal, and I actually found that the same thing was true. I ended up with the same issues and had to turn on that extra menu. So I think it's really important. There might be a calendar out there that could be used more easily, but in this case, it seemed like we're having a really challenging time. One other thing to keep in mind that's really very interesting about using apps is that often the iOS apps themselves can often have access to more tools than you might have with any other apps. So for example, with the calendar, the iOS calendar that's native, it gives you access immediately to that scanning menu and to that increment decrement. Whereas in the Simple Cal, I couldn't get access to that. So it's a really important thing to keep in mind that you might think, oh, I have this other app that I really like to use, but it may or may not work as well with the scanning tools as perhaps the native iOS app might work. Let's go in now to messaging. So I'm going to go into Messenger, and I'm going to tap that. One thing I found here, and of course it's signed me out for some reason. One thing that I found with Messenger, and also actually with Zoom as well, is that there are things that I couldn't do unless I used what's called gliding. I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So I'm going to select something and tap. Oops. So I'm going to go into this, and I'm actually going to hit the 2 dots. And I'm going to select gliding, which is on the first line, and it's second from the end. So I'm going to pick that, and you'll be able to see that this is like that radar mouse that I mentioned. So I can use this to make selections. So when something isn't accessible using the regular iOS scanning, you can always go into this gliding feature. So I'm just going to get out of this, and I have to hit the double buttons at the end. And then in order to switch back, I have to actually hit item mode, which is on the upper row. So I'm going to let this scan through. And I'll do it one more time. 2 dots. Oops, I did it again. Sorry, my bad. I mishit. So you can see that you can go through and you can go back into item mode using that. Any questions so far?
There's none in the chats.
Okay. All right. So a couple things that the other thing that I thought was really interesting, I'm going to go into Amazon right now. And right now you can see I'm still in glide. So I am going to get out of it this time successfully rather than missing it. There we go. And now you can see I'm back in item mode. So I'm going to go into Amazon. And what I want to show here is that Amazon actually works okay, but there are some really funky scanning patterns that you might need to get used to. So I'm just going to quickly get into something on here. I'm going to cancel that. I'm going to get into this, and I'm going to start scanning. And often what you'll see is the scanning pattern is really odd. So you can see right now, it's sort of missing the whole middle section. And so it's just interesting. You kind of have to get used to the scanning on here. And for some of the things, like in that case, you saw it went to the top, the bottom, and then it went to the middle. For a lot of our AAC users, that's going to be something they really have to get used to. All right. Why don't we go ahead and switch now to eye tracking, if that's okay. And we're going to switch from my computer back to Alice's TD Pilot. And she'll be sharing the screen.
There we go. Hopefully that's worked.
So in this case, we're going to be thinking about a very young child who's basically an emergent eye gaze user. They like to cook and paint and dance and play music. We want to be able to build their literacy skills, their early math skills. They want to read. There's all sorts of things we want to be able to do, be able to build their skills. Right now, what they can do is use eye tracking in their communication software. Something to be aware of is that in communication software on TD Pilot, we have what's called region interaction, which means that our eye gaze is set up in such a way that it draws your eye to the buttons. You just can select them right away because that's the way they're set up to work. The Apple OS environment is not set up with region interaction. You have to actually use the assistive touch menu to be able to make selections on that in the iOS environment. So the first thing we want to make sure we're doing is setting up the iPad for the individual in such a way that they're going to be able to use it. So we want to, number one, make those icons bigger. Alice showed you how to do that already. The other thing that she didn't show necessarily is you might notice that the text on here is quite large. You can change that as well under, I think it's under display, it's under display and brightness or home screen. Yes, text size under display and brightness, and you can change the text size. The benefit of this is that when they're looking at things on the screen, that's going to be nice and large. So these are the types of things that we want to be aware of and may be able to make use of. So we have this child, let's say, already calibrated using Copilot, TD Copilot. They're using TD Snap, but we want them to be able to do other things. So the first thing we want to think about, again, is that right now we know they can select, but there are things that these apps require. For example, the swiping that Alice showed earlier, that we want to make sure they can do, and even pause for that matter. So let's start with an app called Baby Piano. So Alice is going to open that. And we're just going to start with this app open, because let's say somebody opens it for this child. Baby Piano is a really nice app because it's very simple to play. All you have to do is tap and tap and tap, and it will allow the individual to access it using eye tracking. So Alice right now has unpaused her gaze for the user. And now we have the piano that she can just select the buttons on the bottom, and they will play. And then if she wants to play the entire game or the entire song, she can do that, typically by tapping the upper right hand. So this is a really good game to play. That's great. It gives the child access to really nice, easy ways of getting used to how they feel to track on an iOS environment versus in their communication software. There are differences. You might notice in the center of the screen is the trace that's moving around with Alice's eyes. That trace or that pointer has that continuous loop that's moving. And for some people, that can be really distracting. I'm going to ask Alice to go for a minute back into settings. So she's going to select home. Obviously, our student wouldn't be able to do this. But if we go into accessibility, we're going to select pointer settings. Yep, pointer control. And within this, we can do a number of things. Alice, could you do me a favor and change the pointer size to the lowest it can be, just with your finger? So do you see now Alice has this pointer. Go back out into the iOS environment, if you would. So you see that with this now, it's a much smaller loop. Now, what we find with a lot of individuals is that their eye gets trapped in watching it, that the border go around and around. So if Alice, you go back into general or back into accessibility again and change the pointer size to the highest. What you can do here, you notice now there's a dot in the center of that pointer. That dot gives someone something to look at, and it can often make their gaze far more accurate than it is when they have the smaller pointer. Now, as they get further along in their journey, they may want the smaller pointer that Alice had a minute ago. But for me, actually, and for many individuals who are emergent, having that dot in the middle is really useful, because it would be put the dot on what you want to point at, and that really can help them a lot. Another tool that's really nice out there to get used to the iOS environment is the Photo Booth app that comes with the iPad. So Alice is going to open that up. And the fun thing about Photo Booth is that you can, when you select, you can take a picture, and then you have all of these options, and you can just click on one and to be able to see it. So within this environment, it gives you a way of really easily doing something fun, but that's really rewarding, and it teaches that valuable skill of what it's like to tap in iOS. I think one other thing to be aware of when it comes to using this with students, Alice, if you can go back to YouTube Kids. YouTube Kids is actually a really good one, except for the fact that there are 3 dots that they can get to within this that would get them out of YouTube Kids and into other things. So that's something you want to be aware of. They could accidentally hit the 3 dots next to one of these videos and end up somewhere that they don't necessarily want to be. So I think that's just a really important thing to take a look at. Let's take a look then at a different app. Alice, if you could go to Kindle for me. Kindle is an interesting app because obviously it gives people a way of reading, which is great. Alice may have some things. She has a child's book, a sample child's book there in her library that we can take a look at. Now with Kindle, you actually really don't have to do much. You just have to swipe and pause, or you can kind of look over to the side. Alice, if you can look at the arrow on the side, just below the assistive touch button. Now, this is an important thing to notice. It looks to me like Alice is being drawn to the assistive touch button. It may be something that you need to move in order to make sure that the individual doesn't keep getting drawn to that. That assistive touch button is like a magnet, and it does draw your eye. So within this now, we don't have access to that button on the side that allowed her to change the page. So she does need to learn how to swipe. And this is something that we want somebody to be able to learn, because it gives them access to a lot more apps. The other thing that's useful here is when they're reading, they may want to pause their gaze. So Alice, if you could go into the assistive touch menu, we want to teach the individual how to do this, so how to pause. One thing I want to point out, and then resume, of course. And Alice, if you could go into the settings again and into accessibility. So she's selecting home, and she's going into the settings using her eyes even. So she's in accessibility. If you could go into touch and then assistive touch. This top level menu that you're seeing of the assistive touch can be customized. So Alice, if you can go into customize assistive touch menu. One of the things that you may want to do for a younger user is get rid of a bunch of things that are on here. You may only want to have on here pause. You may only want to have on here home and pause. And those are the kinds of things that you can build over time. In order to get rid of something, all you have to do is, first of all, in the bottom corner, you can see it says 8 icons. You can bring that down to like 1 icon. And so it really can eliminate all of the choices here. The smaller number that you get, obviously fewer choices, makes it easier to use. As you increase that number, it gives the person more that they can do. Now, one thing that you may be aware of is with the scrolling, we had originally on there, scroll up, down, right, and left. And with that choice, that means the person has to select scroll up in order to scroll up. iOS with iOS 16 has introduced what's called continuous scrolling. So Alice, I don't know, have you updated to 16?
No.
Okay, so iOS 16 continuous scrolling means that if you have that on, it will allow you to look at something and immediately scroll without selecting anything else. The disadvantage of continuous scrolling is that you have to actually go back into assistive touch and select tap in order to get out of it. iOS has something called a fallback action. So Alice, if you could get back to the accessibility, we're going to go to fallback action within touch and then assistive touch. The fallback action is where when you do something in iOS, so let's say, for example, I was holding and dragging. After I hold and drag, the fallback action right now is on tap, which means that it's immediately going to go back to tapping. Most of the time, that's going to be what you want, especially for an emergent user, because that's what we do the most. As people get further along in eye tracking, they may want to be able to go in and change that because they want to just repeatedly hold and drag and hold and drag and hold and drag. And then they can turn that back on after a time. But if you turn on continuous scroll, you are going to have to actually go back and select tap as your action. So that's something to keep in mind. Alice, can you go into the Tar Heel Reader website? There are a few things to keep that I think are just wonderful here. Tar Heel Reader's website is fantastic. First of all, it has books in all sorts of languages. Secondly, you can create a favorites menu. So let's say that I go in here, and in fact, I think Alice is in her favorites perhaps right now. So you can go in and select favorites, and it creates then an environment for the individual that they don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about them getting into other things. Alice, I think actually if you select all topics, I think you can select your favorites in there perhaps. But anyway, with the favorites, when you do this, this is a way of giving them access to just the books that you particularly choose. This is a really nice website, and it starts introducing an individual to the ability to browse on their own. So I think it's a really nice way to do it. So we have about 8 minutes left. Alice, is there anything that you feel like we should cover when it comes to eye gaze?
No, I don't think so. I think the only thing that I would add, and I think it would potentially apply to all of the access methods, but particularly eye gaze, is the added kind of thing of thinking about it's okay, especially if they're an emergent user, to have a communication partner or a carer or somebody to take control of some of the actions that need to happen so that they can concentrate on something else. And I think that's quite a big one, especially when it comes to eye gaze and if we're using assistive touch to control something else, is it's like, oh, well, they've got to know how to get to the helm button, then they've got to know how to scroll, then they've got to know, well, if we're actually just working on maybe building up some of their skills, for example, and we want to practice just simple tapping, well, then me as the communication partner, I am going to do all of the navigating into the game, for example, and get the settings right and do all of that. And then I'm going to allow them to explore just the tapping. And we're going to let them concentrate their cognitive load just on that until we can kind of build that up. So I think it's worth kind of mentioning, and certainly when you're doing sessions is letting that person know as well, there's a lot that we can do here. I only need you to do one thing. I'm going to help you with the rest. And just kind of reducing that pressure a little bit.
Before we start taking questions, I just want to go back to this mantra that we have, or these things that we always want to think about. Whenever we're making decisions about what apps we want to use, we need to look at first, what does the app require from the individual, and do they have that skill? If they don't have that skill, is that a skill we actually want to build up in them? Do we want to upskill? Do we want to focus on that skill so that they can use it long term? We want to look at, of course, interest, because as Alice said earlier, motivation is huge in terms of trying something that's hard. And then we want to make sure always that the iPad itself is set up in a way that facilitates use. I think so many times what I see happen is people pick an app, but they don't set the iPad up in a way that actually facilitates more the use of those apps. For example, making the icons bigger, making the text bigger, setting up the assistive touch menu if you're using eye gaze in a way that actually makes sense for that person and gives them access to what they need, but not too much. And then finally, what does the app allow that might make it easier to use? Can you change the font size? Can you, for example, in some of the solitaire apps, you can actually change from having to hold and drag to just tapping. That can be a really great way of making that accessible. So this idea of making sure we're working through those steps will really make these apps more accessible for individuals using these various access methods.